More than 150 people have been injured after a powerful earthquake struck near Turkey's biggest city, Istanbul. The initial quake had a magnitude of 6.2 and it was followed by more than 50 aftershocks. There's no reports of serious damage, and officials say most injuries were the result of people fleeing or jumping from buildings amid the panic. An Israeli air raid on Wednesday struck a school in Gaza City that was sheltering displaced Palestinian families, killing at least 10 people, including 5-year-old twin girls. Israel said it targeted Hamas fighters in the attack, which sparked a fire that ripped through tents. One man described the fire as being like in an incinerator. France, Germany and the UK published a joint statement on Wednesday urging Israel to allow aid into Gaza. It has been 52 days since the last aid truck entered the territory. Israel's stated aim is to pressure Hamas to release the hostages it is holding. The joint statement reads, the Israeli decision to block aid from entering Gaza is intolerable. It says humanitarian aid must never be used as a political tool, and Palestinian territory must not be reduced nor subjected to any demographic change. Meanwhile, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, said Hamas had given Israel excuses to continue its raids in Gaza. And before we go, tonight at sundown marks the start of Yom HaShoah, the day of disaster on the Jewish calendar, memorializing the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. And here in Washington, people gathered on Capitol Hill chanting the Jewish prayer for the dead with photos of victims in hand, marking 80 years since the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. That is World News America today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay with BBC News.
Hello there. It's looking very wet over the next few days for southern China. We've had a seasonal front which has been almost stationary, and that's brought some pretty powerful thunderstorms across southern parts of China in towards Taiwan. Now, the heaviest of the rain and the showers will, of course, be across the equatorial countries, where they'll continue to pummel the land masses here during Thursday and into Friday. And there could be some pretty intense ones at times. But for much of Japan and the Korean Peninsula, it's mainly dry and quite warm, temperatures into the low to mid-20s. 28 degrees for Shanghai, but just to the south of it, we have that front which is bringing the heavy rain, which could lead to some localised flooding in places by the end of the week. 37 degrees in Bangkok, so there is some extreme heat there, but thunderstorms never too far away. And it does look like it's going to stay pretty wet for southern parts of China over the next week or so. Manila, dry, sunny and hot, the temperatures into the high 30s. Heavy rain continues to affect the northern territory of Australia. There could be another tropical cyclone development in this cluster of rain. We'll certainly have to watch that. But towards the south, weather front bringing some wet weather to Victoria and South Australia. A few showers likely, coastal parts of Queensland, otherwise mostly dry here. And a better looking picture for New Zealand, higher pressure building in, and that's bringing more in the way of sunshine. There'll still be a few showers around in Auckland for the next couple of days, and nothing as wet as it has been, and Brisbane mostly dry and sunny.
I think the first signs that I wanted to be a journalist were, as a kid, I started making pretend reports. I always liked asking a lot of questions. I've had a lot of different jobs in journalism. What I've learned is that it's always about the people. The wildfires was a story I was living through myself.
It is really hard to comprehend how life is ever going to get back to normal.
Going to bed at night, not really knowing what I was going to wake up to. Fires were burning right around us, so we were having to take split-second decisions about how to gather pictures and tell this story. I knew thousands of people were leaving their homes and were probably never going to get to go back to them. And in the middle of that chaos, I had to find ways to talk to people about what they were experiencing.
That was my house.
It's all gone.
I think hearing one person's story helps viewers trust what they're hearing. Because when you can empathise, it helps you get an understanding of the bigger picture.
America's peace narrative is increasingly at odds with the situation inside Ukraine itself. Russia is continuing to pound cities like Sumy, as well as mount offensives right across the front line. Will this much talked about ceasefire ever arrive? You can follow us here on BBC News.
World leaders are gathering this week in Washington, D.C., fighting to keep the global economy intact in the middle of a trade war started just down the road at the White House. For the latest developments from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings, join us here on BBC News.
I've come to Dublin to find out why Irish cinema has been making such an impact. I'll be exploring some classic Irish films and finding out about the evolution of the film industry here, which continues to punch above its weight. Join me, Tom Brooke, for Talking Movies on BBC News.
Now on BBC News, comprehensive coverage of the day's important national and international news stories. Newsnight.
As President Trump accuses President Zelensky of harming Ukraine-Russia peace negotiations, could a controversial US plan stop the war and empower President Putin? And as Prime Minister's questions reignites the row over women's rights and trans rights sparked by last week's Supreme Court ruling, we speak to Rosie Duffield, the former Labour MP at the heart of the party's splits on the issue. Good evening, this is Newsnight, brought to you live every weeknight from Broadcasting House with insight and interviews. Later, we're going to look at the winners and losers in this reported deal on Ukraine-Russia. President Trump has claimed the US is very close to brokering an agreement to end the war. First, though, here in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer's position on single-sex spaces, women and trans people dominated Prime Minister's questions today, with Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch accusing him of lacking moral courage. Last week, as you know, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the legal definition of a woman should be based on biological sex under the 2010 Equality Act. Judges also emphasised the Act protects trans people from discrimination and harassment. Here's how Sir Keir Starmer's position has changed since he became Labour leader.
Hello to everyone celebrating the Pride for All festival. I'm proud to be leader of the Labour Party, a party which has a long history of standing with the LGBT+ community, and we're committed to updating the GRA to introduce self-declaration for trans people.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right. But Andrew, I don't think that...
So Rosie Duffield should not have said that. Can you explain to people watching why she should not have said that?
So a woman can have a penis?
Nick, I'm not. I don't think we can conduct this debate with, you know...
Sorry, have I offended you in some way?
No, it's just... look, on the biology, I agree with what Tony Blair said the other day in relation to men having penises and women having vaginas. But what I will say is...
So you changed your position?
Just on the biology, that doesn't help on the gender. A woman is an adult female, and the court has made that absolutely clear.
Let's talk now to Rosie Duffield, the independent MP for Canterbury, formerly a Labour MP until she resigned, in part because of how she says she was treated after speaking up for the importance of single-sex spaces. Good evening to you. Welcome
Hi.
to Newsnight. I'd like to talk to you about the Prime Minister's position, how you feel you've been treated, the fears amongst the trans community, and also some of the practical issues arising from the ruling, if that's OK.
Yeah.
First of all, what do you think of the Prime Minister's change in position?
I think it's just another issue where we haven't really seen leadership or kind of, you know, being ahead of the issues. We've just seen reactions. And when you change your views on so many things, from kind of poverty and child poverty and winter fuel allowance right through to the trans arguments, it's just hard to see that person as having any views at all, which is something I set out in my resignation letter. We don't really know where Keir Starmer stands on things.
Well, we do now, because he says he welcomes the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah.
Does it matter that he or the Foreign Secretary or the Education Secretary once believed one thing, but now believe the Supreme Court ruling?
I think it does matter. I think it's important to be able to change your mind and to take advice from groups that are stakeholders. That's really important, to listen to the arguments. But at the same time, we get accused of all being the same and all being liars and changing our tune. So you have to have some core beliefs. For all of our criticisms about Jeremy Corbyn, and I famously had my clashes with him, he was always a conviction politician. For kind of 30, 40 years, he's had the same core beliefs. And I think if you don't know where the party's going and where the leadership of the party is going, that's actually quite important for voters to know.
Right. But you've said you accept it's okay for politicians to change their mind.
Yeah,
which is
to a degree.
What we have seen here. Do you think the Prime Minister has been on the wrong side of history?
I think he hasn't really understood this issue or drilled down on it, or, you know, he probably thought it was a fringe issue. I think a lot of the people that are now in the Cabinet thought it was a culture war and a fringe thing that wasn't very important. So they didn't listen when we were going, this is really going to be big. They didn't listen at the time.
I'd like to play to you this clip from PMQs today in which you feature. Have a look.
Mr. Speaker, I've always approached this on the basis that we should treat everyone with dignity and respect, whatever their different views, and I'll continue to do so.
What were you thinking in that moment?
I was a bit peed off, to be honest. You know, I've heard it all before, and politician-wise, if you're asked the same question 4 or 5 years in a row, the best way to nip it in the bud is to deal with it at the time. And he's been asked over and over and over again about me to an embarrassing degree. I didn't want to be featured in the hustings for the elections, for example. If he'd answered it the first time, it would just have gone away a long time ago. But he doesn't seem able to answer that straight question.
Right. Do you think you have been treated with dignity and respect?
Absolutely not, no.
Why do you say that?
Because when you've got people briefing against you and then being caught briefing against you, as I have, and being sort of hauled for trial, you know, sort of witch trial. In one instance, I was on trial for 13 months for liking tweets and things. You know, he's never intervened, he's never supported me or spoken to me about it.
Oh, that's interesting. Has he never asked you to sit down with him and explain your views? No. Eventually, after a lot of sort of toing and froing with one of the senior whips just before the election, I think I got 17 minutes with Keir, and that's after 4 years. Right, so you have sat down with him? You have been able to explain your views to him? For about 17 minutes, and it was he looked at me like I was an alien. I don't think he has any concept why women in particular have been so vexed by this. OK. I want to play you another clip and then ask you if you have any concept of why some trans people in particular are so vexed by this. Yeah. And this clip from a trans woman shows the anxiety that some are feeling.
I wanted to leave the UK personally because I feel like I should not stay in a country where I don't feel safe. I want to be able to actually live my life free of judgment, free of having all the time the treading on shells, whether or not I am free to walk among the community around us, and I don't want to keep being in that constant turmoil.
I mean, there's a real fear, real distress. Yeah. Can you empathise with that?
Of course, that's an awful way to feel about your own country. If people are genuinely feeling that sad and that worried, that's awful. I wouldn't want that on anyone. You know, I wouldn't wish that on anyone at all.
Do you think you bear any responsibility for those feelings? I
think the problem with the fact that women's rights and trans rights have clashed is because no one was really drilling down into the Equality Act. In 2010, when it came forward, this wasn't an issue, and we didn't adjust our thinking or look at it or look at amending it. And now it's as though it's the first time we've thought about this. And it's because politicians have buried their head in the sand, all of us, and we haven't dealt with the issue. But
politicians have failed.
Yeah, absolutely. There shouldn't be a clash of rights, but unfortunately, sometimes there is.
You have tweeted or liked posts which some say are transphobic. I'll just read one to you. This was 2020. You wrote on X, "I'm a transphobe for knowing that only women have a cervix." And Jane Haybrook, who is a barrister, tweeted this. "Rosie Duffield's tweet is awful. She is erasing trans men completely. Trans men don't necessarily have their cervix removed. I'm so tired of people not affording other people the dignity they deserve as fellow human beings."
That's a really important point. And to be honest, you know, at the time I probably didn't think about trans men in that moment.
But do you now?
Yeah, of course I do. I know a lot more about the issue now that I've sort of been steeped in it. And at the time, Piers Morgan was making a point that if we put out this language that people need to get their cervix checked for cervix cancer, it is confusing language. I have a lot of migrants in my constituency. They're not going to understand that. If sometimes they don't speak English, their husbands go to the doctor for them. You know, we have to be really clear that this is about women mostly. Of course it affects some people, but you're not telling me that if you've gone through the transition process, you don't still know that you've got a cervix. I mean, I think people should be credited with a bit more awareness of their own bodies than that.
For the record, are you transphobic?
Absolutely not. Of course not. That'd be like saying I don't like, you know, people with a skin colour or trousers or something. Of course not. Absolutely not. No.
Let's talk about some of the practical issues that arise from the ruling. Are you expecting a trans man who's biologically female and looks like a man to use the women's changing rooms at the local baths, for example?
See, that's where this conversation now starts, because we haven't dealt with it. So the court has affirmed that the Equality Act made it clear, or should have made it clearer, we should have interpreted it better, that biological sex is what trumps everything else in terms of those safe spaces.
So the answer to that question is yes.
But probably, but I think providers can do better than that. I think if you're running a leisure centre, it's not beyond the wit of those people to provide safer spaces for trans people as well.
Right.
Unisex loos, or however they go forward, they've got to consult with the trans community, not me. I don't know about those things.
But would you be one of those people advocating for those so-called third spaces?
I think if that's what the trans community want, then absolutely they should be talking to their local councils or their local theatre or museum or whoever provides those spaces. Absolutely, yeah.
Our political correspondent Helen Catt is reporting tonight that political parties are expected to be told that trans women can't be on women-only shortlists, but trans men can. Would you welcome that? Is that the logical conclusion of the Supreme Court ruling?
I mean, I think that's perfectly okay, because women want to be free from men, biological men, in our loos and our changing rooms because of the very physical difference. Men are usually bigger, stronger. They have the actual weapon that causes rape. I mean, you know, there are practical differences, and that's what we've been concerned about.
And even if it's a trans man who's a biological female but looks like a man, I mean, would you welcome them?
That's really not for me to say. I've been there advocating for women's rights.
You know how you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not overly worried about trans men, to be honest. I don't feel threatened by them. I feel threatened potentially by biological men who haven't transitioned.
The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, today asked the Prime Minister if he would be apologising to you. Would you like an apology from Sir Keir Starmer?
To be honest, I'm not bothered. Keir and I don't get on particularly well. I've never called for an apology. It would be nice to think that the things they put me through, he could just quietly say sorry. But it's about the women and men, actually, who've been drummed out of the party, stopped from being candidates. I would never get through the candidacy process now. I sneaked through a few years ago before this was an issue, but no way would I get endorsed now. And I think it's all those people who've been blocked, barred, drummed out of the party, whose name you'll never hear, and there are thousands of them, actually. They need an apology.
They need an apology from, from Keir Starmer?
Yes.
You obviously sit as an independent MP. You left Labour in part, you say, by the way you were treated by some in your party.
Yeah.
Is there a way back for you to the Labour Party?
I'd really like to think so, but you know, if they're going to gaslight me and pretend that they always thought this and that they weren't mean to me really and all that sort of stuff, I wrote before that it felt like an abusive relationship at times. That's very much a strand of an abusive relationship.
And do you
where
still
you pretend
feel like
everything?
That?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no acknowledgement that, you know, they now agree with me.
Right.
You know, there's no acknowledgement of that, and that actually
but isn't
maybe I was
we
right.
welcome the Supreme Court ruling, we accept it. Isn't that an acknowledgement enough?
No, because they actively briefed against me, stopped me, told my CLP things about me that then got into the public domain about my personal life and things like that. So no, not yet. I need to know that I'm safe in the party again.
Thank you very much, Rosie Duffield, for talking to us on Newsnight and to our audience here in the UK and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
And in the coming week or so, we will speak to a guest who has very different views to Rosie Duffield. Let's hear from your panel this evening, Gillian Tett, Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and FT columnist, and Jim Murphy, former Labour Secretary of State for Scotland, and Nick is here, of course. Jim Murphy, let me ask you first of all, what do you think about the way Rosie Duffield says she has been treated by people within your party?
Well, I like Rosie, we're friends.
That's
and I don't enjoy hearing what she shared this evening. And I think when you asked Rosie, would you like to be, or a version of would you like to be back in the Labour Party, I took some comfort from, despite the pain and anger she feels, she said not yet, and I'm hoping over time that not yet becomes a yes, and
right. And
there
what
can be a
would have to happen
reconciliation
for that to be a yes?
Well, I think that's really for Rosie and the Labour Party to work out. I've not followed every twist and turn of the trans debate. When we passed, I was in Parliament and government when we passed the Equalities Act back in 2010, and Rosie is right. The debate about trans rights, I can't remember it even being part of the conversation, and that's not because I wasn't paying attention. I was in the cabinet at the time, and even 5 years later, by the time I left politics, the trans debate wasn't a lively one.
Would you encourage Sir Keir Starmer, who you're close to bring Rosie Duffield back into Labour?
Well, I think personally, my view would be I think Rosie would be much stronger as a Labour MP. The Labour Party would be stronger with Rosie in the party.
And should Sir Keir Starmer make those overtures?
I think Rosie herself said this evening, and I'm only taking it based upon what Rosie said.
Sure. I keep asking you about the Prime Minister and you keep ignoring what
No, you asked me about the Keir and Rosie. My view is that Rosie herself has said this evening, not yet. And I think if Rosie wanted to join the Labour Party and felt welcomed in the Labour Party, then I'd like to see the Labour Party let her back in, yes, of course.
Has Sir Keir Starmer's position changed?
It appears to have, yeah.
It appears to have?
Yeah, because I haven't, as I said to you, I helped pass the legislation in 2010, and then, like most people in Britain, didn't follow every comment by every politician. So I wasn't actually aware of some of the things that Keir has said about this until you showed your package this evening. But in full technically, you've shown there's been different positions that Keir has had. Personally, like Rosie, I'm comfortable with politicians changing their mind if the evidence changes, but of course critics will make a different point of view.
The evidence hasn't changed, that's the point.
Yeah, and that's the point that critics will make.
Yeah. Do you accept the evidence hasn't changed?
I think the law appears to have hasn't changed. What's happened now is there's been clarification of the law.
Right. But the evidence hasn't changed, has it?
I don't think it has, no.
No. Gillian Tett, how big a deal is this for voters generally?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points. Firstly, a plea that this shouldn't poison politics in Britain like it has in America, because it really has been so divisive and so distracting people away from really important issues to do with the economy and
this
welfare.
But this is an important issue for a lot of people.
It's a very, very important issue. But the second point I'd like to say is, please can we stop treating this as a political football or way of scoring points against each other. And you're talking about the fact that 5 years ago this wasn't the agenda. I'd just like to step back and look at this historically, because King's College was the home of Alan Turing. If you think back to what happened to him 70 years ago, he was persecuted cruelly. He was tortured by the government for being gay, because at that time that was seen as something completely unimaginable. Today we look back and say, what on earth was anyone doing? That was completely unnecessary. Why did anyone take these personal choices and identity issues and turn it into such a point of cruelty? And I hope in 70 years' time we've got beyond this incredible pain that so many people are feeling today, and I totally understand the pain on all sides on this one, but we get beyond the pain, rediscover empathy and rediscover tolerance, and actually a way of living together in a practical way that actually moves beyond what should be, at the end of the day, a personal choice.
Is it a failure of politics and politicians that, I mean, we've just heard Jim Murphy say discussion about biological sex wasn't a thing even in 2010. Is it a failure of politics and politicians that a court has had to affirm what the Equality Act meant in terms of sex?
I would argue it almost certainly is, because whenever courts get involved, you end up exacerbating people's pain by putting down clear dividing lines. And that tends to mitigate against empathy and tolerance. And we should all be embracing as much empathy and tolerance in a practical way as possible right now. As Rosie says, it's not impossible to actually start off by saying, let's talk about providing third spaces. Let's talk about being practical and tolerant, and actually one day in the future looking back at this period in the same way we look back at what happened to Alan Turing, you know, with absolute disgust and wondering what were we collectively thinking.
Nick, can I ask you, we're obviously waiting for updated guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Is the government going to leave it to them to essentially sort this out?
Well, Bridget Phillipson, who's the Education Secretary, but in this case the Equalities and Women's Minister, said when she gave the government a reaction to the Supreme Court judgment yesterday that yes, we are waiting for that updated guidance from the Commission, but she will be working with them. I mean, what was interesting, obviously you were talking about Prime Minister's questions today, but there was that very significant statement. What you saw was a very small number of Labour MPs being wholly supportive of the Supreme Court. And the majority of Labour MPs speaking yesterday clearly had deep concerns about it. And when Bridget Phillipson was wholly accepting the Supreme Court judgment, there was noticeable silence on the Labour benches. And just talking to some of those Labour MPs who have concerns today, privately, some of them are being very critical of Keir Starmer. And one of the things I'm hearing is the Prime Minister they're saying has absolutely changed his position, but is not making that clear. They say he's hiding behind the Supreme Court, and they believe the reason why he's doing this is that he fears the threat from Reform UK. And one veteran said to me, Keir Starmer does have a habit of marching the Labour Party up a hill and then abandoning us.
OK. Right, lots of movement tonight on that peace deal on Ukraine-Russia. President Trump says they are very close to an agreement, but he lashed out at Ukraine's President Zelensky, saying he's prolonging the killing by refusing to agree to it. It follows reporting that the US and Russia are discussing a proposal which involves a frozen front line where the Russians maintain control of all the Ukrainian territory they currently hold. Over recent days, several Trump cabinet members have made clear that the US is ready to walk away from the negotiations if a deal isn't agreed, and pretty sharpish. Here's Vice President J.D. Vance today.
We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process. But it's now time, I think, to take, if not the final step, one of the final steps, which is at a broad level, the parties saying, we're going to stop the killing. We're going to freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today.
OK, so let's just have a look at the map with reference to what we've heard from J.D. Vance. There it is. So all the areas in red, essentially, the proposal would seem to be that Russia would keep all the territory they illegally invaded and took from 2014 onwards. Can I ask both of you, first of all, for your reaction to that?
I'm deeply troubled by it. Because, as you say, it was annexed after an illegal invasion. And the lesson that Putin will take, and dictators and tyrants all over the world will take, is that you can annex, invade, slaughter, occupy, and as long as you do it long enough, you'll get a frozen conflict as a reward, and the US may settle for that. And I think we've all grown up in a world where international institutions set a form of rules, and then they're unable to enforce their own rules, and therefore in the recent years we've had various coalitions of the willing enforcing international norms. And now we neither have international norms, nor are we going to have coalitions of the willing able to enforce those norms. And that's really troubling.
What do you think, Gillian Tett?
I would echo all of that completely. I'd simply add that when you look into the details of the front lines they're proposing, or the division they're proposing, much of the rare earth minerals and the crucial ports are on the Russian side. So that really hobbles Ukraine economically. I've just come back from Washington, and the key thing to understand there, as one of the White House advisors said to me, is that these days President Trump is spending 80% of his time thinking about Russia, not about Ukraine. Because as part of their reorientation of the global order, they very much want to find a way to strike a deal with Russia, an economic deal, to essentially underpin what Trump regards as his vision of how the global order is going to be going forward. So Ukraine is being treated as collateral damage in a way that makes my blood boil. And as you've seen, the kind of peace deal, the peace proposals that are coming forward are very much on Putin's terms. I'm not suggesting that President Zelensky couldn't do certain things to try and bolster his case. Mobilizing more of his population to fight is absolutely critical. But at the moment, what President Trump is suggesting is essentially a major coup for Putin.
Right. Nick, there must be nervousness within UK government circles, in Paris, in Bonn, Berlin, etc., etc.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. We had this meeting in London today, the UK, France, Germany and the US, and it was meant to be at ministerial level. It got downgraded to just officials. And the Foreign Office are trying to be upbeat, productive and successful, with progress being made on reaching a common position on next steps. But it is very significant when you have Jim Murphy, former minister, who is very well disposed to Keir Starmer, saying that he is really concerned about this. And I do have to say, I am picking up unease in ministerial ranks about how long Keir Starmer can essentially straddle two horses, how long he can say, well, we're working productively with Donald Trump and we're standing by Volodymyr Zelensky. Because what happened today, the really big thing in the last few hours, is that Donald Trump and President Zelensky are now going head to head, fundamentally over Crimea, where Donald Trump attacked Volodymyr Zelensky, saying, Crimea's lost. You don't have to recognise Russia's claim to it, but it's lost. And it looks like the US will recognise that Russian annexation. What did Volodymyr Zelensky do in the last hour or so? He tweeted out a copy of the Crimea Declaration issued by Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State under the first Donald Trump, which said this is wrong, it's illegal, and Russia must end its occupation. So they are head to head again, and in the government there is unease amongst ministers about where this is
one
going.
of the key problems is that Donald Trump said he could solve the war in a day. He's clearly failed. He hates to fail. So he's on the back foot. Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump have always had very bad personal chemistry. Yeah. They've tried to make that better, but unfortunately it's now got very personal. And that's tragic. And yes, Europe has to step up right now and really do what it can to support. And yes, Keir Starmer absolutely has to show leadership. But unfortunately,
but what does leadership mean? What does that mean now? Take what Nick said. How can he keep straddling two horses? Does there come a point where Macron, Starmer, etc., have to say this is not right, President Trump?
There are more than two horses. I think Nick's underselling the complexity of it. There's the US dimension, there's the EU dimension, there's a relationship with China dimension, and this is much deeper than Crimea and Ukraine. What Keir's trying to do is keep the US engaged in an international rules-based order underpinned by US soft and hard power. Because if the US were to decouple itself from that norm, we then live in a world where NATO is defenestrated, Article 5 no longer exists, the UK then becomes the single biggest underwriter of Article 5 shared security, and that's a world that none of us really want to glimpse into with the consequences that that would have. It's not an immediate physical threat to the UK, but it's an undoubted threat to the Baltic states.
I mean, Jim, one of the things I'm beginning to hear from loyalists to Keir Starmer in Parliament is they're worried about the spectre of Tony Blair and George W. Bush, which is that Tony Blair stood shoulder by shoulder with George W. Bush on Iraq. And if you talk to the Brown camp, your good friends in the Gordon Brown camp, they would say that Iraq war basically destroyed Tony Blair, and he only won the 2005 election when Gordon Brown stood side by side. And there is a worry that Keir Starmer may find himself going down the Blair-Bush route.
So my view, the thing that disrupted the Blair government wasn't so much the Iraq war, but 9/11. Labour had only been in power for 4 years. We had 2 years of spending limits of the Tories that we stuck to, and we had 2 years of free government before 9/11. I think that, look, we'll judge Keir by the outcomes, won't we? And the easy thing for him to do is to get applause lines and tweets by punching Trump on the nose in the way that other leaders have done. Well, let's see if this patient diplomacy works.
If we're looking forward to patient diplomacy, the rubber hits the road around issues like, yes, Europe should absolutely be stepping up its defence commitments. Big time, they're starting to do that. One of the most interesting things to look at now is what happens to the frozen assets from Russia, because they're mostly sitting in Europe right now. And one way to fund Ukraine going forward, if the US does indeed withdraw, will be to use that. And yet, if President Trump is trying to strike all kinds of economic deals with Vladimir Putin, you may start to see some kind of pressure on Europe to not use those assets.
Absolutely. But
Well, I was going to say, you've got these really big breakpoints right now.
There are. And currently, countries are free to use the interest from those frozen assets for Ukraine. But there's not European unity on how to use those frozen assets. I think most recently the Germans have been sceptical about whether they can use the actual seized assets even for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And if America withdraws, we can't use that money to restructure Ukraine. We have to use it to rearm Ukraine. And on that, there isn't consensus in Europe.
Well, if Ukraine ends up being abandoned, it will be shame on all of us.
Absolutely.
And they've been extraordinarily brave in fighting. And let's hope that this is recognised in the White House.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's have a quick look at some of tomorrow's front pages. It is their main story for some of them. The Daily Telegraph, Trump, Zelensky is to blame for no peace. The Guardian, Crimea is lost, says Trump as he warns Zelensky on a peace deal. The Daily Mail, back my peace or lose all of Ukraine, Trump warns. And The Times, Zelensky is the key obstacle to a peace deal, says Trump. Got a few seconds left. Can I just ask you really in a couple of words, the US walking away, what does that mean? Does that mean a withdrawal of military aid, yes or no?
I think it means a crumbling of the Western alliance. And yes, it probably would mean the withdrawal of military aid, perhaps even more importantly, intelligence.
OK. Thank you both. Jim Murphy, Gillian Tett, thank you. Nick is here tomorrow with Paddy. That's it from us. Good night.
I'm Carl Nasman in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. Donald Trump accuses Volodymyr Zelensky of harming peace negotiations after the Ukrainian president said that Kyiv wouldn't accept certain U.S. terms in a deal to end the war. Thousands gather to pay their respects to Pope Francis as he lies in state at the Vatican. And India says it's closing its border with Pakistan following a deadly attack in Indian-administered Kashmir that killed 26 people. Welcome to this extended hour of World News America. We'll be bringing you live news and analysis from right here in the U.S., the U.K., and of course around the world. We begin now with tensions between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, especially with some very public disagreements. On Wednesday, Mr. Trump accused Mr. Zelensky of undermining peace talks after the Ukrainian leader said that he wouldn't